May 16, 1940. While German tanks were crossing France at a speed that shocked the world, something seemingly small was happening thousands of kilometers away. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt made a statement that, to many military leaders of the time, seemed completely absurd. He stated that the United States should prepare to produce 50,000 aircraft per year. To anyone familiar with military aviation at that time, it sounded like fantasy. And when this news reached Berlin, to the office of Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, the reaction was exactly what one would expect from a man convinced that he dominated the skies of Europe. Göring laughed. It wasn't a discreet smile, but an open laugh, described by witnesses as full of contempt. For him, Americans were manufacturers of cars, refrigerators, and radios. They were not an air power. At that moment, the United States possessed little more than 1,700 military aircraft, many of them slow, fragile, and technologically outdated. In comparison, the Luftwaffe had just demonstrated to the entire world the devastating power of its Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel bombers, which dominated the skies of Europe with almost surgical precision. So the question echoing through the corridors of German power seemed obvious. How could a country that barely produced a few thousand aircraft a year suddenly manufacture 50,000? Göring believed he knew the answer. They simply couldn't. But modern warfare was beginning to reveal something that many generals still didn't fully understand. Wars wouldn't be won solely by skilled pilots or brilliant engineers. Wars would be won by industry, logistics, and scale. While Germany relied on the technical superiority and talent of its Luftwaffe aces, the United States was quietly preparing something very different. And curiously, this transformation wasn't happening within military bases or war academies, but within factories that, until recently, produced automobiles for American families. One of the men responsible for this change was a Danish immigrant named William Knudsen. A former president of General Motors, he had left a huge salary to work for the government for just a symbolic $1 a year. His mission seemed impossible: to transform the American civilian economy into a war machine. And Knudsen understood something that few military strategists understood at that time. An airplane wasn't just a weapon, it was a complex industrial product. A fuselage could be divided into sections. Engines could be manufactured in separate plants. Wings could be assembled on another production line. If each part were mass-produced, like an automobile, then perhaps, just perhaps, that number that seemed absurd could become a reality. While Göring and his officials debated in the elegant offices of the Reich Aviation Ministry, American workers were beginning to learn something entirely new. Many of them had never seen an airplane up close. Mechanics who previously tuned car engines were now learning to assemble radial aircraft engines. Women who had previously worked in offices were being trained to operate pneumatic tools capable of fastening rivets into aluminum fuselages. The entire country was slowly changing course, like a huge industrial ship turning to face a storm that hadn't even reached its shores yet. And there was something that German strategists simply couldn't imagine. The United States wasn't just trying to produce more airplanes, they were trying to reinvent the way airplanes were produced. It was a gigantic, risky gamble, and for many analysts of the time, completely unrealistic. Even within the American government itself, there were doubts. Some military aviation officers said it would take decades. Others claimed that the aeronautical industry was too complex to be adapted to automobile assembly lines. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all. While Berlin underestimated American industrial capacity, many Americans also doubted it. But while everyone discussed numbers, deadlines, and technical difficulties, something far more powerful was beginning to happen silently. The country with the greatest industrial capacity on the planet was awakening, and when an economy of that size began to move, it didn't move slowly, it moved like an avalanche. A few months after Roosevelt's declaration, engineers began designing plans for gigantic factories capable of producing aircraft in unprecedented quantities. One such project was being planned in a rural area of Michigan. To anyone looking at that empty lot at the time, it seemed like just another ordinary field in the American countryside. But something would emerge there that would completely change the balance of aerial warfare. A factory so large that pilots of the time said that if you walked from one end to the other, it felt like you were crossing a small town. And inside that factory, engineers were trying to do something no country had ever achieved before: build heavy bombers at the same rate that Detroit produced cars. The question that was slowly beginning to emerge among some of the more attentive Luftwaffe officers was an unsettling one. What if the Americans actually succeeded? What if that absurd promise of 50,000 planes a year wasn't just propaganda? Because if that happened, the war in the skies over Europe would cease to be a contest between pilots and would become something far more dangerous for Germany. It would become a war of mathematics. And mathematics, as some German officers were beginning to realize too late, was a battle that Germany might not be able to win. What no one imagined at that moment was that in a few years, a single American factory would produce more bombers than the entire Luftwaffe possessed at certain periods of the war. And when these planes began to appear in the skies over Europe, day after day, mission after mission, the German pilots would realize something terrifying. It didn't matter how many they shot down, there would always be more coming after them. In early 1941, while war was already consuming Europe, most Americans were still living their ordinary lives. In Detroit, factory workers continued assembling automobiles. In small towns, mechanics repaired trucks, farmers tended to their crops, and families listened to the news on the radio after dinner. For many, the war still seemed a distant prospect. But behind the scenes of American industry, something much bigger was beginning to happen. Slowly, almost silently, the largest industrial machine on the planet was changing direction. And when the United States decided to change direction, it wasn't a small change. It was like turning the steering wheel of a gigantic ship that would take months to complete the turn, but which would then become impossible to stop. One of the most audacious decisions took place in the state of Michigan, on farmland surrounded by simple roads and empty fields. There, the construction of a factory that seemed like something out of an impossible plan would begin. The Ford Motor Company, famous for mass-producing cars, decided to try something no country had done before, producing heavy bombers using assembly line production methods. To many engineers of the time, this seemed like madness. A bomber was not a car. A car had a few thousand parts. A heavy bomber like the B-24 Liberator had almost 500,000 components. There were electrical cables, hydraulic systems, navigation instruments, armor, machine gun turrets, fuel tanks, and 4 gigantic radial engines. Each aircraft required almost artisanal precision. Still, the gamble was taken. As the foundations of the new factory were being laid, curious stories began to emerge among the workers. One of the first mechanics hired to work on the B-24 assembly had spent years repairing tractors in a small farming town. Another had worked as a mechanic for delivery trucks. Neither of them had ever assembled an airplane before, yet they were learning quickly. Instructors taught them how to position aluminum rivets, how to align wing structures, and how to assemble entire fuselage sections with pneumatic tools. It was a new process for everyone. On some production lines, men and women were learning together for the first time how to work with equipment that until then had only been used by aviation specialists. The new factory became known as Willow Run. When it was finally finished, it was hard to believe the size of the place. The building was so large that some workers joked that if you forgot something on the other side of the factory, it would be faster to take a car to get it than to walk. The assembly lines snaked through the interior of the building for almost 2 kilometers. There, an industrial experiment would begin that would change the course of the war. The goal seemed absurd, to produce a heavy bomber every hour, but the first few months were not easy. In fact, they were almost disastrous. Some of the first planes to roll off the assembly line had to be completely disassembled for repairs. In some cases, hydraulic systems were faulty or cables were installed incorrectly. Pilots who received these early models sometimes made nervous jokes, asking if those planes were really ready for combat. Doubts arose within the industry itself. Some critics began calling the factory "Will It Run?", a pun implying that it might never function as promised. But there was something different about that team of engineers and workers. They weren't just trying to produce airplanes. They were trying to reinvent the way they were built. Every problem that arose was analyzed and solved quickly. Aircraft parts began to be divided into smaller modules. Fuselage sections were assembled in different areas of the factory. Electrical systems began to be installed before the structure was completely closed, saving hours of labor. Tools were redesigned to speed up the fastening of rivets. Over time, what seemed impossible began to take shape. Meanwhile, thousands of young Americans were entering flight training. Many of them were boys who had grown up seeing airplanes only at air shows or in photographs. Now they were learning to fly machines like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator itself. At training bases scattered across the country, instructors explained how to operate radial engines with over 1,000 horsepower, how to maintain combat formations, and how to navigate long distances over oceans or enemy territory. These pilots knew that when the time came to fly to war, they would depend entirely on machines built by workers they might never even meet. And then, slowly, something began to change. Production lines sped up. Errors decreased. Teams began to understand exactly how to efficiently assemble each part of the aircraft. What used to take weeks began to take days. What used to take days began to take hours. Engineers realized they were witnessing something rare, an industrial learning curve unfolding before their very eyes. But what no one in Berlin yet realized was the true meaning of that progress. It wasn't just a factory. Willow Run was only one of dozens springing up across the country. Boeing was expanding its production in Seattle. Douglas was increasing its facilities in California. North American aviation was accelerating the construction of long-range fighter jets. Each of these factories was feeding a gigantic system that grew month after month. And when the first large squadrons of these planes finally began crossing the Atlantic towards Europe, German pilots noticed something that didn't appear in the intelligence reports. It wasn't just the quality of the American planes that impressed them, it was the quantity. On some reconnaissance missions, Luftwaffe fighters climbed to intercept Allied formations and encountered something difficult to explain. Rows of bombers stretched across the sky in formations so dense they looked like a metal highway in the air. For the men who had built those planes in American factories, it was a source of pride. For the pilots who were now facing them over Europe, it was beginning to become a serious problem, because even if they managed to shoot down some, more would appear on the next mission, and the next, and the next. Little by little, a question began to arise among the more attentive German officers. How many planes were the Americans really producing? The answer, when it finally began to appear in intelligence reports, seemed impossible to believe. And if those numbers were correct, the air war was about to change from a contest between pilots to something much more dangerous for Germany. It was about to become a war of mass production. In the winter of 1942, something began to happen in the skies over Europe that many German pilots still couldn't explain. At first, it was just small formations of American bombers crisscrossing the sky towards ports, factories, or railway centers. Difficult, dangerous, and often costly missions. The first groups of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were still relatively few, and each mission seemed like a risky experiment. For the young American pilots flying those enormous machines, each flight was a mixture of fear and determination. Many were just over 20 years old. They had trained for months at bases in Texas, Kansas, or California. Now they were flying over hostile territory, relying completely on 4 radial engines and a crew they had often only met months before. The cockpit vibrated with the constant noise of the Pratt & Whitney engines. The air was freezing at high altitudes, and the tension was permanent. A single formation error could expose the entire group to attack by German fighters. The strength of these bombers wasn't just in their size or range, it was in how they flew. American formations were called combat boxes. Imagine dozens of heavy aircraft arranged in layers in the sky, each covering the other with 50 caliber machine guns positioned in upper, lower and side turrets. A single B-17 could carry up to 13 machine guns. When dozens of them flew together, the sky transformed into a veritable defensive fire network. For a German pilot attempting to approach, this meant crossing a field of bullets coming from all directions. Even so, the Luftwaffe aces were extremely skilled. They learned to attack quickly, diving at high speed, firing their 20mm cannons and disappearing before the defensive turrets could react. It was a deadly dance that took place at over 7,000 meters altitude. But something slowly began to change throughout 1943. Initially, German pilots believed they were dealing with limited operations, isolated bombing missions that could be contained with aggressive interceptions. However, mission after mission, the numbers began to grow. First 20 bombers, then 40, then 100. In some accounts from German pilots, there is a description of something that seemed surreal, a continuous stream of planes crossing the sky in perfect formation. One veteran pilot later wrote that looking at that formation was like watching a steel highway floating in the air. And here arises a question that few German officers were asking at that moment. Where were so many planes coming from? For those inside one of these bombers, the experience was intense and unforgettable. The navigator calculated routes using maps and basic instruments. The flight engineer monitored engine temperature, oil pressure, and fuel consumption. The tail gunner observed the sky behind the formation, searching for the silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 emerging from the clouds. Each crew member had a precise function, and all knew they depended on each other to survive. Many American veterans would later remember the sensation of seeing hundreds of bombers lined up in the skies over England before takeoff. The runways were filled with planes ready to take off, engines warming up, propellers spinning like giant fans. It was an impressive sight, even for those accustomed to aircraft. And here, another important detail emerges that often goes unnoticed when discussing aerial warfare. American bombers didn't just fly to attack targets, they flew to test a new strategic concept, large-scale strategic bombing. The idea was simple and brutal at the same time. If you destroyed the enemy's factories, refineries, and logistics centers, eventually their own war machine would collapse. But this required something no nation had been able to produce before, a gigantic number of aircraft operating continuously. And once again, an inevitable question arises. Who could sustain a campaign of this size for months or years? German intelligence reports began to record worrying numbers. It wasn't just the bombers that were increasing. It was the entire structure behind them. More trained pilots, more mechanics, more spare parts, more engines being delivered to bases in England. Some German officers began to realize that this didn't seem like a temporary operation. It seemed like the beginning of something much bigger. And the more they observed the sky, the more they realized that the Americans were flying in increasingly larger formations. Some missions began to involve hundreds of aircraft. For the American workers still in factories in Michigan, California, and Washington, these numbers weren't just military statistics. They were the direct result of their labor, rivet by rivet, engine by engine, wing by wing. Every plane that appeared in the European sky represented thousands of hours of work on an assembly line. Many workers would never see the war directly, but they knew their planes were there. And that created a silent connection between American factories and European skies. Then came a moment that changed the perception of aerial warfare. During some operations in 1943, German pilots began reporting something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. They would climb to intercept a formation of bombers and realize that this formation was not the only one. Behind it came another, and then another. It was as if the sky was being filled with successive waves of aircraft. At that point, even some Luftwaffe commanders began to understand that the problem was no longer tactical, it was industrial. And this leads to a crucial question that was beginning to emerge within Germany itself. If the United States was already sending hundreds of planes per mission at that time, how many were still being built in factories across the Atlantic? Because if that production continued to increase at that rate, what was happening in the skies over Europe in 1943 could be just the beginning. And when 1944 arrived, the world would see something that no military strategist had fully foreseen. An aerial avalanche capable of definitively changing the balance of the war. The first sound many German pilots heard that morning wasn't gunfire or explosions. It was a deep, steady rumble coming from the horizon like distant thunder. At first, it seemed like just the echo of a few engines, but as the sound grew louder, radar operators began to notice something strange. What appeared on the screens wasn't a small formation or two. It was a huge cluster of signals coming from the west, crossing the English Channel towards the continent. To the Luftwaffe, men accustomed to intercepting isolated bombers or small groups, this seemed completely different. It was as if the entire sky was moving. At air bases in England, hours earlier, hundreds of American crews had gone through the ritual that would become familiar to thousands of men during the war. Mission briefing, maps on the wall, routes marked with red lines. Officers explaining industrial targets in the heart of Germany. For many of those young pilots and gunners, it was just another mission day. But that day, there was something different. As they began to taxi to the runways, they realized the line of planes seemed endless. B-17 flying fortresses lined up side by side, B-24 Liberators awaiting takeoff clearance, P-51 Mustangs warming up their engines for escort duty. Radial engines began to roar one after another, 4 engines per plane. Hundreds of planes. The sound combined into a vibration that made the ground tremble. To those who were there, that sight seemed almost unreal. An American pilot would recall years later that looking out of the cockpit before takeoff, he couldn't see the end of the line of bombers on the runway. It was like observing a road made of aluminum wings. Each plane carried tons of bombs, ammunition, and fuel. Each crew knew that a few hours later, they would be flying directly over enemy territory. When the first formations began to rise over the English Channel, something amazing happened in the sky. The groups began to organize themselves, layers of heavy bombers flying in perfectly spaced blocks, forming what strategists called a combat box. Each plane covered the other with its 50-caliber machine guns. Upper, lower, side, and tail turrets created an almost continuous defensive field of fire. For a German pilot trying to close the gap, it was like trying to break through a steel wall. But there was another new element in that scenario. Above and around the bomber formations flew dozens of P-51 Mustang fighters. Unlike the Allied fighters of the early war, the Mustang had sufficient range to accompany the bombers into the interior of Germany and back. Equipped with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and external fuel tanks, it could fly over 2,000 kilometers. Fast, maneuverable, and armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, the Mustang began to transform aerial warfare. For American pilots, this meant protection. For the German pilots, it meant that the situation was changing rapidly. When the first Luftwaffe fighters climbed up to intercept that formation, the visual impact was immediate. Some veterans would later describe looking at that mass of planes as being like observing an entire city flying in the sky. Rows of bombers stretched to the horizon, while escort fighters circled around like guardians. A German ace, Heinz Baer, recounted after the war that, on a certain mission in 1944, he and only a few other fighters were sent to intercept an American formation. When they got close, they realized they were facing hundreds of aircraft. He wrote in his report, "It was impossible to destroy that thing. We'd shoot one down and 10 more would keep flying." This was the reality that began to take shape in 1944. Germany still possessed excellent pilots and fast aircraft. But now it faced something far greater than an ordinary air battle. It was facing an entire industrial system. While the Luftwaffe struggled to replace each lost fighter plane, American factories continued producing new aircraft at a rapid pace. Engines were assembled in Detroit, wings were manufactured in California, aluminum spindles came from steel mills scattered across the country. Everything converged on the air bases in England. For many American workers who never set foot in Europe, the war was happening through these machines. Each rivet placed on an airframe represented one more plane in the sky. Each engine tested meant a possible mission. And slowly, something began to become evident to the more astute German strategists. They weren't just facing pilots, they were facing the industrial capacity of an entire continent. But what would come next would make that perception even clearer. Because 1944 still held a moment that would definitively change the scale of aerial warfare. A moment when thousands of Allied planes would appear in the sky at the same time, in an operation that would show the entire world just how far that American industrial machine had come. And when that day came, it would be impossible to deny a simple truth. The war in the skies over Europe was not being decided solely by courage or skill. It was being decided by production. Sometime in 1944, something definitively changed in the air war over Europe. It wasn't a single combat, nor a secret technology, nor an extraordinary pilot. It was something much simpler and yet much more powerful: scale. Allied commanders began to realize that they now possessed something that no country had ever managed to assemble before in the history of military aviation. Hundreds of heavy bombers could take off on the same day, escorted by hundreds of long-range fighters. This wasn't just an air force. It was an avalanche of metal flying towards the industrial heartland of Germany. At the bases in England, the crew's routine was already fully integrated into this new rhythm of war. The pilots arrived for briefing and, looking at the maps, realized that the targets were increasingly deeper within German territory. Synthetic fuel refineries, bearing factories, aeronautical production complexes, and strategic railway hubs. Each mission was part of a larger strategy. The objective was simple to explain, but extremely difficult to confront: to gradually reduce Germany's capacity to produce and sustain its own war. An American gunner named Frank Delgado recounted years later that he never forgot the feeling of looking out the side of a B-17 during a mission over Germany and realizing that the sky was completely filled with Allied aircraft. He described it as a flying city. Bombers in perfect formation, with Mustang and Thunderbolt fighters circling around like armed guards. Even for men accustomed to danger, that sight was impactful. It wasn't just a military mission, it was proof that an entire nation was working to get those planes in the air. While this was happening in the skies over Europe, production across the Atlantic continued to advance at an impressive pace. In American industrial cities, workers arrived at factories before dawn and found assembly lines already running. Rivets were installed on aluminum fuselages, wings were aligned with millimeter precision, radial engines were tested before being fitted to aircraft. Many of these factories operated 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. For thousands of Americans, that routine became a form of direct participation in the war. Among these workers were stories that would become symbols of that national mobilization. Women who previously worked as secretaries or teachers began operating pneumatic tools on the assembly lines. In some factories, entire teams of women began assembling complete fuselage sections. The nickname Rosie the Riveter spread throughout the country as a symbol of this change. What many did not expect was that the precision of these new teams would improve some industrial processes. Inspectors reported that certain sectors of production experienced a significant reduction in structural defects after the reorganization of the teams. At the same time, new aircraft continued to emerge. The P-51 Mustang fighter consolidated its reputation as an ideal escort for long-range bombers. The robust and powerful P-47 Thunderbolt became an excellent ground attack aircraft. B-17 and B-24 bombers continued to form the backbone of the air campaign. Each model had its specific technical characteristics, but together they formed an integrated system that began to put constant pressure on the German infrastructure. Luftwaffe reports began to reflect the scale of the problem. It wasn't just the number of Allied aircraft, it was the continuity of operations. Even when successful interceptions brought down bombers, new groups appeared in the following weeks. Each mission seemed to be just part of a larger sequence that showed no sign of stopping. For German pilots, this meant facing the enemy repeatedly, often with fewer resources and fewer experienced pilots. In 1944, American production figures began to reveal something that many military strategists had never imagined a few years earlier. In that year alone, the United States produced more than 90,000 military aircraft. This volume was so large that it surpassed the total production of some countries during the entire war. Each of these planes represented a huge chain of workers, engineers, transporters, and technicians spread throughout the country. Meanwhile, in the skies over Europe, bomber formations continued crisscrossing the continent. In some missions, more than 1,000 Allied aircraft participated in the operation. Heavy bombers headed towards their targets, while escort fighters patrolled the surrounding airspace. The combination of quantity, range, and coordination was beginning to completely alter the balance of aerial warfare. For many American veterans, the feeling of being part of this collective effort was difficult to explain. A pilot could be sitting in the cockpit of a B-24 over Germany, knowing that that plane had been assembled by workers who might never see a battlefield. A factory worker in Detroit could be installing an aircraft engine, knowing that in a few weeks that same plane could be crossing the Atlantic to war. It was an invisible connection between factories and battlefields. As the year progressed, even some German leaders began to realize that they were facing something that went beyond traditional military capabilities. The war was transforming into a contest between entire industrial systems. On one side, an economy that had been mobilized to produce on a gigantic scale. On the other, an industry increasingly pressured by bombing raids and resource shortages. And then, slowly, a conclusion began to emerge in the more realistic reports of the time. Germany still possessed advanced aircraft and experienced pilots. But the United States possessed something even more difficult to combat. A seemingly inexhaustible capacity to build new aircraft, train new pilots, and continue flying mission after mission. This meant that the air war was entering its decisive phase. Because when one side can replace losses faster than the other can inflict them, the outcome begins to seem inevitable. In the final months of the war, something began to become clear to everyone in the skies over Europe. Pilots, mechanics, radar operators, and even civilians looking up could already perceive that the balance of the war had definitively shifted. The sound that had once appeared occasionally on the horizon was now almost constant. The deep roar of hundreds of radial engines crisscrossing the sky had become part of the soundscape of war. For many Allied pilots, that sight still seemed impressive, even after dozens of missions. Rows of bombers flying in perfect formation, escorted by fighters circling like invisible guardians, advancing towards targets that, just a few years before, had seemed unreachable. But there was something more happening at that moment. Something that many of the men involved in the war only began to understand after looking back. Those planes weren't just fighting machines. They represented the collective strength of an entire mobilized nation. Each aluminum fuselage carried thousands of hours of labor from workers, engineers, technicians, and transporters. Each installed engine had passed through factories, workshops, and tests, involving people scattered throughout the American territory. For the young men who piloted these aircraft, it was often impossible to imagine how many hands had participated in building the machine that now carried them through hostile skies. Among German pilots, perceptions also began to shift. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on advanced technology, rigorous training, and the individual skill of its pilots. And indeed, many German aces were extraordinarily skilled. Some amassed hundreds of aerial victories, but even these pilots began to realize something that no individual skill could solve. They could shoot down bombers in combat. They could win aerial duels against Allied fighters. Yet, the next day, new formations would appear on the radar, and the next day again. The air war had ceased to be a contest between squadrons. It had become a contest between entire economies. There are accounts from post-war interrogations that reveal the psychological impact of this change. Some German officers admitted that, at a certain point, They realized they weren't just fighting against airplanes. They were fighting against a gigantic industrial system that seemed impossible to stop. Even when new technological projects emerged in Germany, such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, the advantage was already tipped. The Me-262 was incredibly fast, about 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter of the time. It was an impressive machine, but even revolutionary technology couldn't compensate for the difference in scale. Producing a few hundred advanced aircraft wasn't enough when the adversary could produce thousands of conventional aircraft and continue developing new technologies at the same time. For American workers who never flew in combat, the victory also had a profound meaning. In industrial cities, many laborers followed the end of the war on the radio, while still inside the factories that had helped build that gigantic aerial machine. Some had spent years installing rivets, adjusting instruments, or assembling engines. Many would never see the pilots who flew the aircraft they helped produce. Still, they knew they were part of something bigger. They knew that each plane that came off the assembly line helped protect soldiers on the battlefield and brought the war closer to an end. When the final figures began to be analyzed after the conflict, the scale of the transformation became even more evident. Throughout the war, the United States produced hundreds of thousands of military aircraft, heavy bombers, fighters, transport planes, training aircraft. It was a volume that no military strategist of the 1930s had considered possible. That massive production not only guaranteed air superiority, it completely redefined the concept of industrial mobilization in wartime. And this is where the emotional twist in this story comes in. At the beginning of the war, many Axis leaders believed that the United States was a powerful industrial nation, but lacked the military discipline necessary to compete with highly organized totalitarian regimes. What happened was exactly the opposite. An open society, with volunteer workers, private companies, and millions of ordinary citizens decided to join forces to defend something greater than individual interests. The result was an industrial mobilization that transformed automobile factories into arsenals of democracy and made ordinary workers a fundamental part of the victory. For many American veterans, this story isn't just about airplanes or production numbers. It's about people, about pilots who faced dangerous missions in heavy bombers, about mechanics who worked through the night on frozen runways in England to keep aircraft ready to fly again at dawn. About workers who spent long hours on assembly lines knowing that every rivet installed could mean the difference between life and death for a crew in combat. In the end, the air war showed something that continues to be remembered to this day. Victory doesn't depend solely on technology or individual courage. It depends on the ability of an entire nation to work together when the situation demands it. Pilots in the sky, engineers at the drawing boards, workers in the factories, and citizens supporting the national effort. When all these elements come together, the result can change the course of history. And perhaps that's why this story remains so powerful decades later. Because it shows what happens when a country decides to use its industrial strength, its creativity, and its determination to face a global challenge. The planes that crisscrossed the skies of Europe during those years were not just war machines. They were symbols of a national mobilization that proved that freedom, cooperation, and collective work can overcome any threat. If this story brought back memories, curiosities, or reflections for you, write in the comments. Many viewers of this channel lived through that era or heard accounts from family members who served during those years. Share your experience or your opinion. And if you want to continue exploring true stories of military aviation, the Cold War, and the great conflicts of the 20th century, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps keep these stories alive and allows more people to learn the details that are often forgotten in history books.